My stepfather held me by the waist, his breath burning my neck. Hot hands, frantic heartbeat, forbidden intimacy. We were too far gone to stop. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't pull away. How did I ever get to this point? How did everything in my life turn upside down in that moment? This is not just a story of passion, it was something more. Something that destroyed everything. And you can't even imagine what happened next. I can't say that my life was anything special. An ordinary American family, my mother, my stepfather, and me. We lived in a small house in the suburbs, and everything in my life went on as usual. I was 20, I studied, worked, saw friends. As for me, I never paid much attention to my stepfather. He was part of the house, part of the usual background. 65 years old, calm, balanced, not very talkative. It was always like this with him. If he was there, you knew it, but you didn't notice. He wasn't pushy, he didn't interfere in other people's affairs, he kept his distance. Even with his mother, they had more of an even, respectful relationship than anything filled with passion. He was just there. Our conversations were short, more out of necessity. How are your studies? Fine. Are you having dinner with us? I'll eat in town. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary. But at some point, it seemed to me that something had changed in the air. It's hard to explain, but there are moments when you suddenly notice things that previously seemed insignificant to you. For example, the way someone looks at you. I started to notice his gaze. It wasn't a long, searching look, no. It was more subtle. Sometimes, when I passed by, he'd hold my gaze a split second longer than usual. Or when I was talking to my mother at the table, I'd catch him looking out of the corner of my eye, then quickly looking away. What was wrong with that? Maybe I was just overthinking it. But the feeling did not go away. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't overnight. I just suddenly realized that I was now noticing his presence, too. And maybe he was noticing mine. I never thought that everything would change so abruptly. It all happened in a couple of weeks. Just recently, Mom was alive, active, with her usual tired smile after work. And then headaches and weakness began. She complained that she didn't feel right, but, as always, brushed off the doctors. I'm just tired, she said. I believed her. But one day she got worse. So much so that we had to call an ambulance. Everything happened quickly. The hospital, the diagnosis, the doctor's prognosis that I heard but did not understand. Stroke. Surgery. The chance of survival was minimal. Until the very end, I didn't believe that she might not be here. It seemed to me that she would open her eyes any minute and ask why I was sitting here so pale. But that didn't happen. She died 2 days after being hospitalized. When they told me, I didn't cry. I just sat in the hospital corridor, staring at one spot. I felt nothing but emptiness. The stepfather arrived half an hour later. He looked older than usual, although he was not young. There were dark circles under his eyes. His lips were tightly pressed together. He sat down next to her, did not say a word. He just sat. That day we returned home together. The house greeted us with emptiness. Mom's things were in their places. Her coat was hanging in the hallway. A cup of unfinished coffee was on the table. Everything was as if she was about to return. I locked myself in my room, lay down on my bed and stared at the ceiling. My thoughts were all jumbled up. I couldn't come to terms with the idea that she was gone. The stepfather did not impose himself. He also went to his own place. The next few days were a blur. People came and went, relatives, friends. I hardly remember anyone. Everyone said the same thing. Our condolences. If you need anything, call. I nodded, but I didn't need anything. My stepfather organized everything. I didn't get into the details. I just followed him, signed the documents, answered yes or no when he asked. He was calm, without emotions, but I saw how much weight he lost during these days. When everything was over, the funeral, the wake, the visits of friends, the moment came when we were left alone in the house. This was the first time I noticed this new reality. Before, if I came home, I knew that my mother was somewhere in the other room. She could be watching TV, talking on the phone, cooking dinner. Now that certainty was gone. There was only him. For the first time in a long time, I really looked at him. He looked tired, older. In the evenings, he sat in the living room with a glass of whiskey and stared into space. Have you eaten? He asked one day when I came downstairs. I just shrugged. I didn't feel like eating. Do you want me to cook something? No, I answered. This is where the conversation ended. But then he asked again. The next day. And then again. At some point, it became strange to me that he cared about me at all. We had never been particularly close before. He loved my mother, that was obvious, but it seemed to me that he treated me more like a daughter due to circumstances. But now everything had changed. Now we were alone. And in this new reality, I began to see him differently. 2 weeks passed, but the feeling of unreality of what was happening did not go away, and every day I woke up with the thought that my mother was about to leave the room, ask how I slept, smile and make me have breakfast, even if I didn't want to. The house seemed too big, too empty, too strange without her voice, which usually rang out in the morning, without the smell of coffee that she brewed every morning, without the familiar sound of footsteps that I knew from childhood and which had now disappeared from this house forever. The stepfather had also changed, but in his silence there was not just grief for the person he loved, but some kind of inner confusion, as if he had lost not only his wife, but also his very support in life, and now he did not know how to continue to exist in this house, which had once been his home. In the evenings he would sit for a long time in the living room with a glass of something strong, without turning on the television, without talking, without doing anything except simply sitting in the darkness, peering into the space in front of him, as if hoping to see something there that no longer existed. I didn't know how to feel about him because I had never seen him like this before, and our communication was always rather neutral, formal, without unnecessary words, without much warmth, but also without coldness, just two parts of the same family that exist parallel to each other. Now his presence became something new for me, something that caused a strange, incomprehensible feeling, as if we were both stuck in the same space, not understanding how to live on, not knowing how to behave, not knowing what to do with the emptiness that had now become part of our lives. One evening, when I was about to go to bed, he suddenly spoke, and his voice sounded unexpectedly loud in this silent room, making me start, because I was so accustomed to silence that I did not even expect to hear his words. "You're not going to stay here forever, are you?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the empty glass in his hand, which he was twirling in his fingers as if he couldn't bring himself to pour himself another drink, although the bottle stood next to him, almost half empty. I didn't immediately understand what he meant, but then it dawned on me that he was talking about home, about how sooner or later I would probably leave because I was only 20 and had my whole life ahead of me. And this house was no longer a place where I was obliged to stay. "I don't know yet," I answered honestly, because I had never thought that I would now have to make some global decisions about my future, when my present had not yet settled in my head, when I had not even gotten used to the fact that my mother would never come back. He nodded as if he expected such an answer, but something in his expression changed, some shadow passed over his eyes, and I suddenly felt that he, too, did not know what to do now, because he, just like me, found himself alone in this house, without the person who was his link with me. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't find the words, because whatever I said would have no meaning, because no words could change what had happened, could not bring back to this house the one we both had lost. But that evening, for the first time, I thought of him not just as a stepfather, not as a man who lived with us and was my mother's husband, but as a man who was now alone, and this thought made me feel something strange, something that I could not fully understand then. Another week passed, but the feeling of emptiness in the house only grew stronger, turning each minute into something viscous, endlessly stretched out, as if time no longer moved forward, but simply hung between the past and the present. I did not know what to do with this feeling, and it seemed that my stepfather did not know either, because his habits were different, his gaze became heavier, and his presence in the house was now felt differently than before. We hardly spoke, but it wasn't alienation or coldness, rather. We both simply didn't know what to say when every conversation could inevitably devolve into mentioning Mom, and neither of us wanted that. But there were moments when the silence between us seemed like more than just silence. One evening I went downstairs to get myself a glass of water, but as I passed the living room I saw him sitting there again, in the semi-darkness, with a glass in his hand, lost in thought. I stood in the doorway, watching him for a few seconds, and suddenly felt a strange desire to break the silence, to attract his attention, to make him look at me in a way he had never looked at me before. "Drinking alone again?" I asked, taking a step into the room and leaning on the door frame, tilting my head slightly, watching as he slowly turned his gaze to me. He looked up, and there was something new in his gaze, something that made me hold my breath, something that wasn't just tiredness or sadness. "I just don't feel like sleeping," he replied, shrugging his shoulders, but he didn't look away, as if he suddenly saw me differently than usual, as if in his eyes I was no longer just a stepdaughter, but someone he began to notice. I moved closer, slowly, unhurriedly, giving him the opportunity to look at me, assessing, noticing details, the thin fabric of my t-shirt, barely hiding the outline of my body, short shorts that revealed too much, bare feet sliding on the cold floor. "You know alcohol doesn't solve problems, right?" I said, grinning and leaning forward against the back of the couch, letting strands of hair fall forward, creating the illusion of casual but deliberate carelessness. He looked at me carefully, too carefully, holding his gaze a little longer than he should have before looking back down at the glass in his hand, but I noticed it took him a second to look away. "What solves the problems?" he asked, and there was something quiet but tense in his voice, as if he himself did not understand why he was asking this question of me, why he was continuing this conversation at all, which was not ordinary. I smiled, tilting my head to the side slightly, allowing him to catch the movement of my shoulder, the subtle line of my neck, allowing him to see more in me than he was used to seeing. "Sometimes it's just good conversation," I said, then reached out, lightly touching his wrist, squeezing my fingers a little longer than necessary, as if testing how he would react to this contact, to this game I had suddenly decided to play. He didn't pull away, but I felt his muscles tense under my palm, the air between us growing thicker, as if there was suddenly less oxygen in the room. I didn't know what I was trying to achieve with this gesture. I didn't know why I was doing it at all, but I wanted to see how far I could go, how far he would let me go. My stepfather looked at me again, but there was no longer that distant look in his eyes with which he usually looked at me, and this made me feel a strange, almost intoxicating excitement, not from the alcohol, but from the situation itself, from the realization that something had begun to change, that there was now something new between us. The next few days passed as quietly as before, but in this silence something new appeared, something that seemed to ignite a spark inside me, slowly turning into a fire that grew stronger with each passing day. Now, when we bumped into each other in the hallway, his gaze lingered longer than necessary, and I felt him assessing me, not as he had before, not just as someone who lived in the same building, but as a man who had suddenly begun to notice a woman. Every movement he made seemed intentional to me. When he passed by, his hand seemed to touch mine by accident, a light, fleeting touch, but it burned the skin as if he was leaving a mark there. I started to feel something strange when I was alone with him. I wanted to test how far I could go, how much I could embarrass him, how much he would let me play this dangerous game. One evening, as I was emerging from the shower, wrapped in a thin towel that was held to my body only by the movement of my hand, I ran into him in a narrow doorway in the hallway. He paused and his gaze slowly slid over me, starting with the damp hair stuck to my neck, lingering on my collarbones, my exposed shoulders, the way the thin fabric barely covered my hips, leaving too much open space. I didn't move. I just stood there and watched, feeling him inhale tensely, feeling his fingers curl into a fist for a moment before he forced himself to turn away, to step aside, to let me pass. But I didn't go further right away. I allowed myself to linger a second longer than I should have, watching him struggle with himself, his gaze twitching back and forth between me and trying to pull away again. "Is something wrong?" I asked, tilting my head slightly to the side, feigning slight nonchalance, as if I didn't understand what was happening at that moment. He held his breath. I saw his chest rise and fall slowly, saw his fingers twitch again, as if he wanted to say or do something, but changed his mind. His voice was hoarse, as if he had been silent for too long, as if the words were difficult for him. "Aren't you cold?" I chuckled, feeling something inside me clench at this almost innocent question, which wasn't really about whether I was cold. "No, I'm even hot," I replied, shrugging slightly, deliberately letting the towel slide a little lower, revealing the line of my shoulder, before finally taking a step forward and walking past him, feeling his gaze burning into my back. After this incident, everything became even more tense. I could feel him watching my every move, his eyes involuntarily dropping lower as I passed, noticing that my shorts were a little shorter and my t-shirts a little looser, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for him not to stare as I stretched out on the living room couch, deliberately letting the hem of my t-shirt ride up just above my hip. But the most interesting thing was that now he began to respond to me in kind. As he walked past me, his hand seemed to accidentally touch my back, a little longer than necessary. When I sat down next to him, he would slowly turn to look at me, but not just like a stepfather, but like a man trying to hide what was going on in his head. When I got up from the sofa, his gaze lingered on my figure a little longer than might have been appropriate, but he never said anything, never did anything for which he could blame himself. And that was precisely what was most dangerous. Because I felt he was fighting with himself. But the question was not whether he would be able to win this fight, and how much time he still has left before he gives up. That night, it all started as usual. I came downstairs when it was already late, almost midnight. I didn't feel like sleeping, and I knew he wasn't sleeping either. We'd been walking on a knife edge for the last few days, pretending nothing was happening between us, but the tension had become almost unbearable. I walked into the living room and as I expected, there he was, sitting on the couch with a glass in his hand. But this time, the TV wasn't even on. Just a dark room with the only light coming from a table lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. "Can't sleep again?" I asked, walking toward the kitchen and deliberately not turning on the light, so as to leave the room in that semi-darkness in which the boundaries were erased and reality seemed something blurry. "Not today," he answered, and I heard his voice sound different than usual. When I returned with a glass of water, he was already looking at me. He no longer pretended not to notice. He no longer looked away. I sat down next to him, a little closer than I should have. I felt the warmth of his body next to me, heard him breathing, slowly, tensely, as if trying to control something that was no longer controllable. I don't know who made the first move. Maybe it was me, when I stretched out my legs and my foot touched his knee. Maybe it was him, when his hand rested on my thigh, a little harder than an innocent gesture should have been. But it happened. At some point, I turned to him, and we both froze, holding our breath, as if we understood that another second and there would be no turning back. I saw him looking at me, studying me, as if giving himself one last chance to change his mind. But no one changed their mind. His hand slid up slowly, and my body seemed to reach out to meet it. It wasn't a sudden, abrupt moment, on the contrary, it was so slow, so lingering, as if we were both savoring every second, as if we knew it would be too late to stop. When his fingers touched my back, running down my spine, it took my breath away. I didn't resist when he pulled me closer. I didn't protest when his fingers slid over my skin, exploring me as if he was doing this for the first time, but also as if he knew my every reaction in advance. I felt the heat of his body, his hands, slow, strong, tenacious. My shirt was the first to hit the floor. I didn't even notice when he pulled it off because his lips were already on my collarbone and his breath was so hot it sent shivers down my spine. And then I did something I didn't even expect from myself. I allowed myself more. His shirt was unbuttoned, my palms slid over his naked torso, feeling the tense muscles under my fingers, the heat of his skin. And everything would be as it should be. But something inside me trembled. In one moment, in one short moment, I saw the whole picture from the outside. I saw us in this dark house, on this couch, in this wrong situation that had gone too far. I pulled away abruptly, breathing heavily, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. "No," I exhaled, bringing my palms to my face, closing my eyes, as if trying to erase everything that had just happened. He froze. I didn't look at him, but I knew he was looking at me. "Shit," was all he said before he leaned back, running his hand over his face as if trying to compose himself. I couldn't stay here any longer. I simply grabbed my t-shirt from the floor, pulled it back on, ran up the stairs barefoot, locked myself in my room, and began frantically packing my things in complete silence. I needed to leave. Right now. When I left the house with my suitcase in my hands, he didn't try to stop me. He just stood in the doorway, in the shadows, watching me leave, and said nothing. Because we both knew that it was impossible to stay close any longer. When the door closed behind me, I froze for a second, clutching the handle of my suitcase. The cold night air hit my face, burning my skin, bringing me back to reality. To leave. Just get into the car, turn on the engine and drive away, that's all I need now. My heart was still pounding and my breathing was short, like after running. My chest was constricted by a strange feeling, like regret, but I pushed it away. I did the right thing. I had to stop. If I hadn't done this, there would have been no way back in the morning. I looked at the house, where the dim lights were burning in the windows. He was standing there in the hallway, his shirt still unbuttoned, his shoulders tense, his arms frozen at his sides. He didn't move. He didn't say a word. He just watched. I turned away, got into the car, inserted the key and started the engine. I left without looking back. During this time, I managed to find a small apartment, get a job, and start living differently. I didn't try to contact him. He didn't either. But every time I returned home late at night, when I entered the apartment where no one was waiting for me, where it was quiet and empty, I caught myself thinking about that night. About what I felt when he looked at me. About the way his fingers slid over my skin. About how hot it was at that moment when we almost crossed the line. And about how I stopped. Sometimes I felt like if I hadn't left, everything would have been different. But then I reminded myself that no, we had gone too far, but we realized in time that the road ahead only led to a dead end. I could call him, say something that would break this silence between us. But I didn't do it. And he too. Because we both knew it was better not to go back to where we had just barely escaped from. I closed my eyes, leaned my head against the back of the sofa, and took a deep breath. Now it's just a memory. Nothing more.